From LA to Piscataway, you've come to the right place to talk all things Big Ten. Welcome to Big Ten TED Live.
We are fresh off of a Big Ten national championship. We are fresh off of the University of Michigan claiming the gold as the very best team in all of college football, the only undefeated team in all of college football. And now that the 2023-24 season is officially behind us, it is time to look in the rearview mirror one last time. Because there's a lot to talk about this offseason. The 2024 season is going to be like nothing we have ever seen before, with all of the changes within the Big Ten, within all of the changes within college football. There's a lot to talk about starting basically tomorrow. But in terms of today, in terms of tonight, we're going to take a look back in the rear view mirror in 2023. And we're going to talk about all things Big Ten this season. It was a season. This season seemed to go very fast. It seemed to really fly by. And I believe maybe the off the field stuff had maybe something to do with that, right? Instead of on Mondays, Tuesdays, and Wednesdays, Thursdays, instead of maybe focusing on the field of Michigan playing Purdue or Michigan State going head-to-head against Indiana or something like that, we were kind of focused and a lot of attention was on the off-the-field things within the Big Ten. Of course, it started in the offseason with Northwestern and then Michigan State, and of course, what happened at the University of Michigan throughout this season as well. But it's that same Michigan team that is standing strong at the end of all of this as the national champions. I don't think there's any doubt as to who is the best team in all of college football. So we're going to be talking about Michigan, right? Because that is the storyline in terms of the 2023 season. It is the very first Big Ten national champions since Ohio State took the crown in 2014. We're going to be talking about that. We're going to be talking about Big 3 versus Little 11. There was a pretty large disparity between the two, between those three Big Ten East teams at the top and really everybody else. We're going to be talking about that as well, and then obviously kind of breaking down a lot of these other teams as well. We're going to be talking to the Big Ten Network's Connor Onion about everything here once he joins us on the program. Before we get to that, let's get into some comments. Who's here tonight? Big Ten TED Champions Club member, Big Ten Johnny John Chenard is in here tonight. Paul Wall is in here tonight as well. And Michigan versus the world. There's nobody left in the world because Michigan conquered them all. A 15-0 season for the Michigan Wolverines. And more from Big Ten Johnny. Watching Michigan get kicked around after a good first-round performance reminded me a lot of what happened with TCU. I would not compare them that closely. I think TCU was never in that football game. Like, let's call it as it is. All right. Washington was in this game, third quarter, late third quarter. Heck, even going into the fourth quarter, Washington had a chance with a touchdown to tie up this game. So I think there's a little bit of a difference there, but I understand. I at least understand what people are saying when they bring up that comparison as well. And more from Michigan versus the world, the beginning of a new era within the Big Ten. This year, 2023, has kind of acted like a bridge year of sorts, right? Because at the beginning of the season, we knew Oregon was coming in, we knew Washington, we knew USC and UCLA, we knew all of those teams were coming in. We knew it was going to be the last year of Pac-12 football. It was the year before, it was the final year, I should say, of the 4-team college football playoff. We knew we were going to 12 teams next year. We knew we were getting, hopefully, the video game next year. We knew that there were so many changes. And 2023 was kind of the last of a generation, so to speak, that I hope we appreciated it. I hope we appreciated this era of college football. And I think more traditionalists out there are kind of shedding a few tears about this era of college football that we are now leaving behind. But there's a more exciting era of college football upon us starting in 2024. Later on in this program, we are going to be talking about the new schools that will be joining us because I've kind of been covering them as quasi Big Ten members, right, throughout this season. But now it is official. Now it is official. Now you can really start covering these teams as if they are Big Ten members as well, with Oregon, with Washington, with USC, and with UCLA as a part of this conference here going down. All right, folks, let's get to it. It is time to review this season. It is time to take a look back in the rearview mirror. And with that now, I am pleased to be joined by Mr. Connor Runyon of the Big Ten Network. Connor, it is great to see you as always. Man, did you have a busy year.
Yeah, good to see you, Ted. No, it's been fun. Crossover season, I think, officially ended with last night being the final day of the college football season. So should be smooth, easy sailing the rest of the way, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's kind of dive into this right now. It was, correct me if I'm wrong, but this was your first year calling Big Ten football, correct?
Yeah. I had done some spring games in the past, but this was my first year of doing a full slate of Big Ten regular season games. So it was a blast. I think I had a game 11 out of the possible 13 weeks. So it was, like you said, it was busy mixing that in with some Big Ten volleyball too.
What stood out to you at some of these football games? You go in, you talk in your production meetings, you talk to coaches, you talk to players, you get to see these towns, coming in a day or two early. What stood out to you in your first tour around this conference in the booth for BTN?
First of all, I really appreciate that Indiana serves us barbecue in our pregame production meetings. that's a big up to them. I was thinking about this before I came on, and I think I hit exactly half the league, at least of this iteration of the Big Ten, getting to cover 7 of the 14 teams. And I believe it was 6 different venues because one game was a neutral site. I had the Indiana-Louisville game at Lucas Oil Stadium. And that's kind of I think, a standalone conversation as far as which venue I enjoyed the most, just because it was an NFL stadium and they had catering in the booth for the pregame meal. They had a bathroom in the booth, so you didn't have to go far at halftime. But really, every place that I went had something that I appreciated that I never would have known unless I was actually in that booth. I think of like the height of the Indiana booth, the Northwestern booth. They're like 9 stories, 8 stories high, something like that. So working with Matt Millen, who was my partner for most of the year, he really likes the all-22 view, which is, for people that are unfamiliar, it's kind of almost like the surrounding view or the overhead bird's eye view of the action. And that's what we got even without replay in those places. And that's not something I would have picked up on if I just thought I was watching from home on the 50-yard line camera.
What are some of the coaches? Because you covered Indiana early on in this season. I'm sure Tom Allen was a joy to talk to, the character that is Tom Allen, who's now the defensive coordinator at Penn State. Who are some of your favorite coaches to talk to on a week-by-week basis?
Oh, man. I really liked Brett Bielema. He wasn't somebody that I got to talk to until late in the year at Illinois. We had them twice in November. So that was fun because I hadn't interacted with him before. PJ Fleck is always somebody that takes the conversation to a place that you're never quite sure where it's going to go. We had some really good conversations about football, obviously, and we were there week 2, and then we were also there a little bit later in the season when things weren't quite going as well. And he was always gracious with his time, no matter how the season was going. Of course, at one point they led the West and looked like they might go to their first Big Ten championship game ever. And then, of course, the season didn't end up that way for them, finishing 5-7. Trying to think who else. Didn't get to meet with Purdue in person. It's always a little bit different when you do it over Zoom. We had a really good meeting with Ryan Walters and his staff over Zoom, but looking forward to potentially doing that in person next year. Those are some of the. I'm sure I'm leaving somebody out that we had a good conversation with, but those are kind of the ones right off the top of my head that were top of mind.
Finishing off here with your story, and then we'll get into some football here. What was a game, maybe top two, whatever? What were some of those best games that you enjoyed that you were on the call for this season?
Yeah. By the way, left out David Braun. That should have been an obvious one. Our crew had Northwestern games. I think we had him 3 or 4 times, and he was so thoughtful with his answers. Of course, I think a lot of people that watch your show and that followed the Big Ten all year long kind of know Northwestern's story and how he fits into that. And I feel like I shorted him by not mentioning him in that first answer. But let's see, our crew got we were really fortunate with how close our games were. I would say that the run in November really stands out to me. The 4 games we had in November. The first one was Illinois, Minnesota, which was the game where John Paddock, the backup quarterback for Illinois, came in with a minute and some change left. 4th and 11, they're down 1 score. Completion on 4th and 11, first down. Completion for another first down. Game-winning touchdown to Isaiah Williams, and he kind of became a legend in that moment. And then he did it again the next week, and our crew had the overtime game against Indiana. He threw for like 507, threw the touchdown to Isaiah Williams again, and in what turned out to be kind of the antithesis of Big Ten West football. It was a 48-45 game. So those were our first 2 games in November. Third game was Northwestern beating Purdue to become bowl eligible. That was notable because of how the season started for Northwestern. And the final game was Maryland Rutgers, and Taulia Tagovailoa sets the all-time Big Ten passing record. So we got really fortunate, especially in those final 4 games of the year, that something big and memorable happened every single game.
All right, let's dive into the storylines of this season as we've got Connor Onion from the Big Ten Network talking all things year in review for the Big Ten in 2023. We can't talk about this season and this conference without mentioning what happened one night ago. The Michigan Wolverines capturing a 15-0 undefeated season. Some games were closer than others. Of course, that final stretch where Jim Harbaugh was suspended, Sharon Moore kind of takes over and leads this team through that type of adversity to find their way to win a national championship. Is this the best Big Ten team we've seen, at the very least, in the East-West era? And how far back do you think we have to go to maybe say this is the best Big Ten team since?
Yeah. I mean, the first place my mind goes to that is 2014 Ohio State, which was the 2015 national championship game, the last Big Ten team to win the national title. But that Buckeye team lost a game. So I think if you compare the resumes, this Michigan team would have the edge just because of that one loss. If we're pretending we're Bill Hancock and the College Football Playoff Committee here. I don't know, 2002 Ohio State, that team won the national championship, famously beat Miami. That was Maurice Clarett and Craig Krenzel. I think that's maybe a team you could compare this Michigan team to, but I don't think there are many. And I think, to your point, in the East-West era, this team is definitely up there as one of the top 2 or 3 teams that we'll talk about for a long time as being the best.
I think it's the 1997, right? That's been kind of compared recently. That was the undefeated Michigan team, of course, that had a split national title with Nebraska that season. 2002 Ohio State, of course, Maurice Clarett really carried that team. How overly impressive were they? This defense, though, for Michigan. Let's talk about this defense for a minute, because there might be a time in the future, 2 years down the road, 3 years down the road, where you see all 11, you go to 12, 13, 14, 15, all these guys might be playing in the National Football League. How impressive from your eye was this Michigan defense this season?
Well, look who they did it against last night. They did it against Michael Penix, a Heisman candidate, a Heisman finalist, and then the Joe Moore Award-winning offensive line for the best offensive line in college football. And I think the offensive line and probably the defensive line to an extent for Michigan acknowledged that going into the media availability for the national championship game that, we thought we should have won it. We should have been the best offensive line for the third year in a row. And I think that the guys on defense picked him up and played like it at times. What they did on third down really, really impressed me. I think Washington was 2 of 14 on third down. So who they did it against in that game with those stakes, I think kind of cemented what you just said about Michigan's defense. Is that's why we're talking about them as an all-time team in the Big Ten. Of course, the offense isn't that either, and we can have the Corum and McCarthy and offensive line conversation with those guys. But I think you nailed it. It's because of that defense that we're talking about this as an all-time team.
Well, and there was a narrative here throughout this season as well, and I kind of addressed that after the game last night, where some of these Big Ten defenses right towards the top, the Michigans, the Ohio State, and Penn States were there. And maybe you can kind of speak on this because you maybe saw some of those teams that weren't exactly explosive on the offensive side of the ball, but there was kind of this narrative that those teams were ranked highly because of maybe the lack of really good offenses that they played. But I kind of combat that with, look at Ohio State holding Missouri scoreless for 3 quarters in that Cotton Bowl, and look at what Michigan did against Alabama and the best offense in the country against Washington. Penn State had an off day against Ole Miss with a lot of opt-outs in that game as well. So you've kind of seen both ends of that spectrum. Kind of how would you kind of characterize the matchups and the comparisons with some people that say, well, they're highly ranked defenses because you have the Iowas and the Nebraskas and some of those offenses like that?
Well, that's the fun part of the playoff and getting to see different teams from different conferences play each other is, if you put Washington's offensive line in the Big Ten this year, are they still one of the best in the country? I think they absolutely are. Where, maybe in past years, if they're just playing West Coast teams, they get characterized, probably mischaracterized as, that's soft West Coast stuff, and there's no way that they hold up against the Wisconsins and the Iowas and the Ohio States and the Michigans as far as the trenches. But the way, especially on the defensive line that Washington played last night, I think that proved that they're going to fit just fine as far as the physicality of the Big Ten. After that first quarter, when it looked like maybe we were headed for a Georgia TCU type game when it was 17-3, that defense was unbelievably good. And I thought they would play that way from the beginning. And I think the thought, at least that I had going into the game last night, was we're either headed for 45-42 or we're headed for like 17-10. And I think we kind of started to push more toward that 17-10 type game once Washington's defense finally settled in. So,
boy, how about the reemergence of Donovan Edwards, right? Kind of coming from out of witness protection, as I kind of said last night. And he's going to be kind of a focal point next year. So that was kind of, or in theory, if he comes back, he can go to the next level. But it seems like he should maybe be able to progress pretty well into that role. Let's kind of go to another big storyline as well, because Michigan, Ohio State, and Penn State really seem to separate themselves from the rest of the Big Ten. Back in the day, you said the Big Two and the Little Eight, right? Talking about the separation between Michigan and Ohio State and the rest of the conference. You could go the Big Three and the Little 11 this season. Do you think that dominance, apart from the rest of the league, was more about the rest of the league's maybe mediocrity and maybe being down, not having the depth? Or was it more due to just how good those top 3 teams were in the league this year?
Yeah, I think it's this is maybe an evergreen statement. I think it's finances. I think it's money. I'm sure you probably read some of the same stuff I did this summer when USA Today came out with that story about the means, the median, the max, and the minimum for some of the revenues for some of the schools throughout the country. Ohio State, unsurprisingly, was at the top as far as revenue in the Big Ten at $251 million in 2022. And then Rutgers, I think, was at the bottom, and it was like the low $100 million revenue mark. So that comes back to recruiting budget. That comes back to all the resources that go into this thing. And I think I don't want to say it's that simple, and not that a lower revenue team can't beat a higher revenue team, but the top 3 teams in the Big Ten generate the most money, spend the most money, and we saw that play out in the field again, like we have in several years past.
And it's going to be interesting. And we're going to talk about the future here later in the program. But it's going to be interesting to see where the Oregons of the world, where we know that they have an influx of cash. You look at a program like a USC that has a lot of support as well, how they kind of factor in, right, in terms of those top programs here going forward. A big storyline, talking points was the off-the-field distractions as well at Northwestern, at Michigan State, at Michigan. Boy, it would be it'd be a heck of the year off the field if one of these things happened. But 3 of these things happened, right? Preseason with the hazing at Northwestern. You had Mel Tucker and his situation at Michigan State, and then, of course, the sign stealing allegations with Connor Stallions over at Michigan. What is your takeaway on how each team responded to each of these off-field distractions? Because there was a pretty big differential in some of the responses from Northwestern, Michigan State, and Michigan.
Yeah. First of all, amazing job by Northwestern.
Yeah.
I was, after watching them their first game against Rutgers, I wanted to give them the benefit of the doubt that they could rally around that situation, and maybe they win 3 or 4 games. That was my cautiously optimistic thought on Northwestern. Then I watched them play that Rutgers game. I think it was in week 0, not even week 1, really, really early in the year. And I thought, maybe the people are right that are saying they're not going to win a game. They had an FCS game for homecoming, and maybe that would be the one that they would get. But then they beat UTEP, and then they had that big comeback against Minnesota. But then Ben Bryant got hurt against Penn State, their starting quarterback, and I thought, okay, this is where maybe we're going to start to see what we thought preseason. Maybe that was their one big moment against Minnesota, and they're not going to win. But Brendan Sullivan came in. They had arguably their best offensive game against Maryland late in the season. Ben Bryant comes back, and then they just win a bunch of one-possession games to close out the year and end up being bowl eligible and beating Utah in their bowl game. So definitely surprised. But the more and more you talk to David Braun and spent time in that facility, the more you could just kind of feel it. And Northwestern was really good about allowing us to ask some hard questions. Not that we need the permission, but giving us access to players so that we could have some FaceTime with a Ben Bryant, a Cam Porter, one of the running backs, have some of their defensive guys in and pick their brain a little bit. And you could just kind of feel you could feel, one, that I don't think David Braun was sleeping very much, but also that there was motivation every single day that they did want to prove people like me and maybe people like you that they were better than a one-win team, and they definitely did that.
And that, because you look at what Northwestern, also you mentioned a lot of guys there from Northwestern and quarterbacks and stuff, but I think one guy we forgot to mention was the milkman, right? I love the story, and I know you kind of I forgot which game was that you were on the call for.
Maryland,
was that the Maryland game? Yeah, that you kind of explained the Jack Olson type of thing, and going to the barn and everything. That was really good to kind of see from that. But Michigan State kind of went in a different way. Right, this was a team with Mel Tucker and how that all got right in the middle of the season as well. And then all of a sudden, I forgot who they played the next week, but I remember it being a pretty difficult game. But for Michigan, Washington, that's right, it was Washington, the non-conference game. They just went down the other way, right? This was a Michigan State team that just had trouble responding, and it was for them. It was all about turnovers, right? They just couldn't take care of the ball. I will say this, and I want to ask you this with Michigan. Some people have said out there that this national championship might have some questions behind it. Some people even said there might be an asterisk next to this championship. How do you kind of view how this Wolverine title will be viewed in the next 6, 12, 18 months from now after all that's going on off the field with Michigan.
I'll say this, and I don't know what information will be uncovered in the next couple weeks, the next couple months, or over the years ahead. But I'll say this, just from watching them on the field and knowing what I know right now, I'm convicted in saying that they are definitely the best college football team in 2023.
Yes.
And, November 3rd was the day that Connor Stallions, who was right at the head of the sign-stealing scheme, that's the day that he resigns. And after that date, Michigan went on the road, beat Penn State. They beat Ohio State for the third straight year. They beat Alabama. I shouldn't skip the Big Ten championship. They beat Iowa in the Big Ten championship game. They beat Alabama, and they beat Washington. So their 5 biggest games of the year came after that, after there was heightened sensitivity to that from their opponents. I'm sure heightened sensitivity internally not to be doing that, and they won all those games. So with the information that I have at this point on what day is today, January 9th, 2024, I'm convicted in saying that Michigan is the best college football team in 2023, and I think they know that. And you can make the argument that maybe if they played Georgia, maybe Georgia got them, but common opponent, Alabama beat Georgia in the SEC championship game, and then Michigan beat Alabama. So, unfortunately, not everybody gets to play everybody. But from what I saw this year on the field, and Michigan proved it obviously in the playoffs, getting in the national title game, they are the national.
Yeah, but they have to be. They have to be. You kind of, and we're gonna. I'm sure we'll find out stuff in the next months as we continue on through the winter and eventually hit the summer as well. Let's kind of move on to a division that has now, well, all divisions have ceased to exist, but one of our favorites here at this channel, and of course some other outlets as well, the Big Ten West. Okay, this division hasn't exactly been explosive, right, for some time, ever since its inception in 2014. It's been about defense, physicality, trenches, and some might say, notice how I said some, not me, some might say ugly football. Because beauty is in the eye of the beholder, Connor. But let's be honest. Let's call a spade a spade. This year was about as low as it's been in the conference, or in the division, in the Big Ten West, I should say. Did it surprise you just the lack of production from some of these teams on the offensive side of the football, even considering the Big Ten West standard?
Not entirely. And I agree. I think it's beautiful. And,
it is.
Being a Chicagoland kid, it's the football at the college level and to an extent the NFL level that I grew up on. So I'm down with it. I'm down if these teams want to keep playing that style of football. You just go team by team throughout the league or throughout that division. Iowa, I'd say self-explanatory. That's right. How they play, if you want to call it groupthink, and how everybody else started playing, fine. But it kind of seems like it's the Iowa division of football, and everybody's modeled themselves after that. Minnesota, I know up your way, new quarterback after several years of Tanner Morgan. Mo Ibrahim, all-time leading rusher. He graduated, moved on. And then there's a new offensive coordinator for Minnesota. So not totally surprised that they weren't super high-powered on offense and that they were led by their defense at times. Northwestern, who we talked about before, quarterback was injured for about half the year, Ben Bryant. Illinois, a little bit surprised there by the penalties and some of the holes they had in their offensive line. That was not really Brett Bielema-esque, and this was surprising at times. They had much better moments late in the season. Nebraska, 3 different quarterbacks played. Wisconsin, Tanner Mordecai, quarterback gets hurt. Braylon Allen, their star running back, hurt for a little bit. And then Purdue, I think, got mischaracterized a little bit. And I know there was some antsiness from the fan base there on, when's the offense going to get going? I thought they figured it out in their Illinois game.
Yeah.
I think they put up 45 points in that game.
Mm-hmm.
But then what came next? They played Iowa. They played 4 of the top 5 defenses in the Big Ten all in a row after that, including Ohio State and Michigan, and didn't put up big numbers. Then they put up 49 after that. Hudson Card gets hurt. Not a good game for the offense. Hudson Card, their quarterback, comes back, and they score 35 points. So I think their offense was a little bit better than maybe even what their scoring numbers say they were. And I have no question with Graham Harrell as the offensive coordinator and Hudson Card coming back that they're going to be at least decent on offense next year.
Let me touch on this this ugly versus beautiful argument, because I've seen it go on a few ways. I could see how fans can maybe think that this is an ugly style of football. But when I watch Iowa, and we'll kind of progress into Iowa next, when I watched Iowa games each and every single week, I was on the edge of my seat because you knew every single play meant something. If they can just get a 20-yard pass, it completely changes the game. We talked about Washington before. If Washington got a 20-yard pass, that's what, 1 out of 20 or 30 plays that they run during a given game. That's why at least when I'm watching this game, it was all the chess match. That's one part that I love about football is the strategy and the chess matches. When you watch the Iowa Hawkeyes throughout this season, is they continuously played field position because they knew one of their biggest weapons was their punter in Torrey Taylor. So it's just, that was all very, to me. Okay, I grew up in Wisconsin, now living in Minnesota, lived and worked in Fargo for a little bit. So I'm Midwestern. I could understand somebody that maybe lives out in L.A. or at Oregon or something like that, how they could maybe see it differently. But that's the great thing about football, especially at the college level. You got many different flavors of ice cream. Okay, I might like chocolate. You might like vanilla. Actually, in this case, mine would be vanilla. But if you like chocolate, it's all good. It's all good. Let's move on to the Iowa Hawkeyes. Let's move on to Iowa for a minute, because injuries really hit them hard early with Cade McNamara going out in that Michigan State game. I think he was kind of banged up a little bit even coming into this season. His mobility was limited coming right out of the gate. And this one, Luke Lachey goes down. Eric All goes down. They were extremely limited from the start, but to go 10-2 with Deacon Hill and neither of your top 2 passing targets at tight end, and Caleb Brown didn't really get going until November, to go 10-2 with that team, I think that just shows how good of coaches that Kirk Ferentz and Phil Parker are.
I agree. And I don't think an Iowa conversation on any talk show can not begin with Phil Parker at defensive coordinator. But, you mentioned Luke Lachey, their tight end, going out with the leg injury early in the year. I thought there was a chance he could go on to have a Sam Laporta type season, who's doing great stuff with the Lions now in the NFL. So I think that was a big part of where their season headed offensively. That's not to say they were going to be a 50-point per game offense, but you lose your quarterback, you lose one of your top tight ends, and a pretty tight end friendly offense. It's going to put you behind, and that happened before you got into Big Ten play in full. So you get him back next year. You get McNamara back. We'll see how and who is calling the plays, but I think those are 2 things right there that, if I'm an Iowa fan, I have optimism in that it is going to look better and it is going to look different from last year, and you're always going to have a good defense.
Yeah, I'm very curious because that offensive coordinator hire is really going to determine the outlook, I think, for Iowa fans as we look forward. There's been a lot of rumors out there about Paul Chryst, right? Paul and Kirk KF have a good relationship back to when Paul was in the Big Ten coaching at Wisconsin. How would you like to see Paul Chryst and Kirk Ferentz kind of work together on this offense? Because it seems like they share a similar philosophy.
Yeah, it definitely does. It definitely would make sense. I think the Iowa and Wisconsin Big Ten West formula, it's definitely transferable from when Paul Chryst was at Wisconsin. And kind of what we were talking about before is like, I hope that type of football stays. And I think if Iowa has any say in that, when the 4 new teams come in, they will. I don't think they're changing for anybody. And I think it's more those 4 teams are going to have to change to Iowa, and hiring a Paul Chryst would kind of help keep that identity at least somewhat the same, and hopefully, for their sake, an enhanced way by scoring a few more points. But I do think it makes a lot of sense, both because of their relationship and also because of their philosophy.
Because when you look at Iowa, okay, when you look at the Hawkeyes for next season, I think their top 2 linebackers, I think Higgins and Jackson are both coming back. Quinn Schulte is back. Like, they got a lot. I think Jamari Harris is coming back. I'm not sure if we heard on Sebastian Castro quite yet, but they got a lot on defense coming back. And it's been this way even when they went to the Big Ten title game in 2021. Just give us an offense in the 80s nationally. Just don't give us 128. Don't give us 130. Like, that's the thing for Iowa is you look at these defenses the past handful of seasons. It's a shame because these are championship level defenses. The players that have come through the system, specifically in these last 3 years, Iowa, ever since Phil Parker has been the defensive coordinator, has been a great defensive team. But especially these last handful of seasons, man, it's been unfortunate because you pair an offense that's average with that, and they're right in the Big Ten championship mix. I firmly believe that. Let's move from Iowa. We talked about Northwestern before, but I just kind of want to finish up on the Wildcats here, going from 1 win to 8 wins. Nobody, aside of those people maybe in that locker room, and who knows, maybe there were kids and coaches in that locker room back in August that said, I don't know about this, that even thought that possibly. But when they've been successful in the past, it's mainly been really good defense, running the football, things like that. But this is a Northwestern offense that's a little bit different. They kind of opened it up a little bit this year with Ben Bryant, and then when Brendan Sullivan was kind of filling in as well.
Yeah, they did. And, having guys like Cam Johnson and Bryce Kurtz at wide receiver have good years helped. The Minnesota comeback win that they had in overtime, and they were down 21 points in the fourth quarter, that was the Bryce Kurtz game.
Yes.
I think he went for over 200 yards in that game, including a big touchdown on a slant and go in the first half that kind of got the offense kickstarted. So, this is full disclosure. I've actually known Ben Bryant since he was a sophomore in high school. We're from the same hometown, went to the same school. So it was really fun kind of following his journey from sophomore starter at the varsity level at an 8A school in Illinois to a guy that's bouncing around a bunch. He's at Cincinnati. He's behind Desmond Ritter, goes to Eastern Michigan, plays well there, comes back when Desmond Ritter goes to the NFL, and then he gets to transfer to his hometown school. But to kind of have that 10-year window into seeing Ben Bryant play, not incredibly different as far as his skills. Of course, physically more mature than he was as a 15, 16-year-old. Always super smart, always really accurate. But to see him be a little bit more emotive, he's still a pretty stoic guy. But I think being around David Braun brought more emotion out of him. And there were shots of him crying with his family after the game when they beat Minnesota. He played through injury in the bowl game and showed quite a bit of emotion compared to what I'm used to seeing from him in those moments. And I think that was a bit contagious for the guys around him on that Northwestern offense. And that was kind of an under the radar thing outside of scheme and some of the stuff he saw on the field that really impacted them this year.
When you look at Ben Bryant, and I said this coming into the season, I'm like, I predicted, full disclosure, I said 2 wins for Northwestern coming into this season. Howard and UTEP, right? I think we're the 2. But you look at Ben Bryant and what he did throughout his career, it shouldn't be overly surprising that at the very least he had a decent season. I think the surprising part, at least on offense for me, was the emergence of and just how good some of these receivers were at times. Like you mentioned, Cam Johnson, Bryce Kurtz really taking a big-time step forward. A.J. Henning, of course, in this offense as well. And there were some players, and that running back this season, Hyman, was really electric and explosive at times. I love the future of this program. The Big Ten, of course, is going to look a lot different, but I really like what Northwestern has going on. Let's kind of switch gears. Let's go to my Badgers, the Wisconsin Badgers, for this native son of the Badger State. It's hard when you flip a system. Like Wisconsin essentially, okay, we won't talk about the Gary Anderson era, but essentially has been playing the same type of football since Barry Alvarez said you better get your season tickets now. Okay, they've been lining up, single back, I formation, whatever, couple of tight ends, and they are pounding the rock. And then Phil Longo comes in, and all of a sudden we want to bring in Tanner Mordecai and pitch the ball around the yard. It's hard, even in today's day and age where you can flip a roster, it's really hard to flip a roster that has 20, 25, 30, whatever years of DNA and to flip it immediately. And I think you saw that with Wisconsin this year.
Yeah, definitely. We were talking about Iowa before and how they're not going to change for anybody. I kind of thought that with Wisconsin too, but it is exciting to see them try something different. I think if Tyler Van Dyke can come in from Miami and look like the guy he did as a freshman when he was being talked about as a potential first-round draft pick in the NFL, like that is definitely playable, and maybe even more playable in the new Big Ten when you do have the West Coast teams to play shootout type football with. And defensively, I think Luke Fickell has really good taste. I like Mike Tressel as current defensive coordinator, who was with him at Cincinnati. Of course, Fickell had Marcus Freeman on the staff at one point. Those teams had Sauce Gardner and Brian Cook, DBs that are now in the NFL. So the mix of that new look offense plus Luke Fickell having really good tastes defensively, I feel like 7-6 was a really good place to start. But I do think we'll start to see Wisconsin get back into that mode of 9 to 10 wins just become routine for them.
You've had programs in this division, and we'll talk about the Nebraska Cornhuskers later. They've won 3 games. They've won 4 games. Wisconsin, I believe, has hit bottom right at 6 wins last season before Fickell came in. And then a 7-5 season where they nearly win 8 is kind of like, and Badger fans are kind of like, oh, they're kind of disappointed a little bit. Your program's doing fine, just like Iowa last season when everybody thought the sky was falling. You went 7-5, and I think they beat Kentucky in the bowl game. You go 8-5, your program's in pretty good shape if you think your season wasn't that great, and that's exactly how things went. Braylon Allen, let's talk about him and his legacy. This is RBU, okay? I might be coming from red and white shaded glasses when I say that, but I've watched a lot of Wisconsin running backs over my time, and I've watched some of them within Camp Randall Stadium, and it just happens year after year after year. It seems like they have a great back there. What do you think is Braylon Allen's legacy within Madison, Wisconsin? Because I believe his injuries this season being banged up might have cost him a win or two.
Yeah. Besides being the guy that everybody referenced as the 17-year-old running back when he first got there.
Oh, gosh. I forgot about that one.
Yeah. I think I think it's going to be a pretty good legacy. You probably have your own Mount Rushmore of Wisconsin backs, which I'd be interested to hear.
That's a tough one.
but I think I think they might be chiseling away on some of the stone to have him up there with even some of the recent guys like Gordon and Monty Ball and some of the guys we've seen over the past 10 to 15 years. He's right up there with guys as far as durability. I don't know, because he has been injured. So that's kind of a tough one. But obviously the size stands out. That's why my mind went to durability.
Right. Yeah, I get it.
But I don't know. Would he be in your top 4 as far as?
Let's kind of talk about that. We got Michigan versus the world, and I agree with him. Ron Dane, Heisman Trophy winner, clear number 1. Melvin Gordon is on that. Monty Ball is on that. I think after that, that's where the debate starts. I think that's where you can kind of start that debate. I don't think James White is on there, despite the good NFL career he kind of had with the Patriots and that great play that he made, possibly the Super Bowl. I don't think Brian Calhoun is quite on there. I believe Braylon Allen is just maybe off of there a little bit, because you got to look at Michael Bennett. Okay, that's a name maybe people forget a little bit as well. Like you kind of go through all of these names, and there's a lot of really good ones. Okay, even like guy John Clay was in that like 2010 type of range as well. I think at 4 I'm throwing Jonathan Taylor. Okay, I think that's where I'm going with this. I think I'm going Dane, Ball, Gordon, and Taylor as my Mount Rushmore. And then you got guys, like I mentioned, Braylon Allen, a Michael Bennett, a Brian Calhoun, and a P.J. Hill is another one. Like there's players that were in there for like a year or two that some people that aren't Badger fans might have, oh yeah, remember he had a good year. He had close to 1,000 or he had 1,000 yards. I think that just proves where Wisconsin possibly is at this point. But to have, 3 seasons? I don't think he got obviously he didn't have 1,000 yards this season, but to have 2 1,000-yard seasons and then to have a pretty good year this year despite injuries, not be on that Mount Rushmore, I think it just goes to tell you how good Wisconsin has been at that position.
Yeah, definitely. I think
let's go into the next team a little bit as we're talking about running backs. At Illinois, there was a running back that really came on at the end of the year, Caden Fagan, really, because Reggie Love was in there and he kind of maybe didn't get going. But it was this running game, because it seemed like when Caden Fagan got going for Illinois at points, it seemed like the offense got better, right? Because that offense was trying to find their spark early in the season. And then Caden Fagan, he was kind of injured towards the end of the year as well. This was an Illinois team. Boy, you talk about a roller coaster. They were riding that roller coaster. It was kind of down to start, and then it kind of came up, and then it went back down towards the end of the season. How important do you think was Caden Fagan for the results that were good kind of in the middle of the year for Illinois?
Yeah. Talking about Braylon Allen, that's the guy that Fagan always got compared to. Any meeting that our TV crew had with an opposing defensive staff when we had Illinois this year is, that's Braylon Allen 2.0 right there, because he's a taller back and he's 245, 250, and I don't know that I covered a running back this year where I saw second level defenders take bad angles on more than when they tried to tackle Fagan. And I think some of that was the anticipation that here's this big back coming at me and he's not going to beat me with speed. But we saw Fagan outrun some angles this year. There was a swing pass, I think in the Minnesota game, where he went for a 55, 60-yard touchdown, where the angles were just off. And I think it was because of that. And he hadn't really shown that next year speed in the couple of games that he had played yet, and all of a sudden he was gone. So he's similar to what we talked about with Braylon Allen. Like if he can stay healthy, I think he ends up potentially being an all-time great at Illinois. They can keep him healthy, keep him there, and I think he has all the ability in the world to be able to be in that conversation with Illinois too.
I said in my Illinois season preview at the beginning of the season, I think this is a team that needs to throw the football around a little bit more. And when Illinois was finding their success, boy, they did not look like a Brett Bielema football team, or at least a traditional Brett Bielema football team. This team could sling it. Isaiah Williams, right? Juice Williams 2.0 really got it going at points during this season, as was one of the best receivers in this conference throughout this season. Did it surprise you that it maybe took a while for this offense to kind of get going in the pass game as long as it did? And kind of we can kind of chat about the difference between John Paddock and Luke Altmaier, because Luke, it was all about his legs early on in the season and creating with that rushing attack. And there was just so much pressure on him. I remember the Kansas game. I remember after that game saying, there's too much pressure on him. It's Luke. Yeah. Luke is the team. They kind of need some more. And I feel like when they went to John Paddock, that's kind of when they found more of this football team. Yeah.
Penn State comes to mind too, where Altmaier was just under constant heat. Sure. That was pretty consistent for a lot of the teams that saw Penn State in that defensive line this year. But I think with Isaiah Williams in particular, he kind of broke out in November. There was a bit of a roof on the defense over the top of him for a lot of the year. I think going into the Minnesota game, it had been 3 or 4 weeks in a row up until then that he had an explosive catch of 20, 25 yards or more, and then he goes for over 100 in that game and does the same the next week. And one of those games, the Minnesota game, that was Altmaier at quarterback the entire game until the final drive. And then the next week it was Paddock at quarterback. So both guys had their moments and that connection with Isaiah Williams. So I don't think it was totally quarterback dependent. I think it was mostly matchup driven and coverage driven. But I think the protection early in the year let Altmaier down, and that's until they figured out their pass protection a little bit, stopped holding on every play. That kind of slowed the progression of Illinois' passing game, and it was probably week 8 or week 9 or whenever we hit the turn into November when they became a threat to become bowl eligible again that we really saw the pass game kind of break out again.
We'll go through these next two pretty quickly. Minnesota and Purdue. The Gophers discovered Darius Taylor this season. The defense seemed to take a step back in a 5-7 season, but in a 5-7 season where you beat 2 out of your 3 at least regional rivals in Nebraska and Iowa, you got to think that at least, hey, maybe that's something to hang your hat on for the Gophers.
Yeah, definitely. And it feels like we've had this conversation with every running back, but man, if Darius Taylor stays healthy, he leads the Big Ten in rushing. And he did at the time that he got hurt. And he showed that again in their bowl game against Bowling Green. He gets through little creases maybe better than any running back that I covered this year, where you think it stops for 2 yards, then all of a sudden he's got 12 on him. And they didn't, the first week of the year, they didn't really use him that much. It wasn't until Eastern Michigan and then the 2 weeks after that, which I think were North Carolina and I forget who was right after that, but he went for Northwestern. Went for 198 against Northwestern. Yeah. So he showed pretty early why he was the quote unquote gem of that recruiting class, and they were very, very happy in Minneapolis to hold off Michigan and Michigan State from keeping them in state.
So, yeah, and then this defense takes a step back, and then they kind of lose almost half of their identity with Joe Rossi going over to Michigan State as well. It'll be very interesting to see how Minnesota possibly bounces back. Let's head to Purdue. You go into a first year. That's never easy. They had a non-conference schedule that wasn't the easiest, right, in the world. A good G5 team in Fresno State. What they were able to do, Syracuse, we all know how that ended up as well. It's hard learning a new defensive system with Kevin Kane and Ryan Walters in there for the Boilermakers. And they had one of the toughest schedules, right, I think, with both Michigan and Ohio State on their slate. How would you kind of break down year one of the Ryan Walters era in West Lafayette?
Yeah. We touched on it a little bit before, but I think offensively, like they started to find it midseason, and they've got some air raid principles, but they run the ball. Their best offensive game of the year, we saw 2 backs go for over 100 yards, and that's maybe one of the more interesting conversations I've had talking with Graham Harrell, their offensive coordinator, because of his influence with Mike Leach. We asked him, what do you think the late Coach Leach would have thought about how you ran the ball last week, going for over 100 with 2 backs? And he said, Coach Leach would have looked me in the eye and said, "Why are you bunting?" And we're like, what do you mean? He's like, Coach Leach would have said, "You're bunting. You called a run play. Not only did you call a run play, you called it 30 times." Yeah. So that was one of the more colorful conversations, and I think they'll continue to lean on that. Devin Mockabee is a really fun guy to watch with his crazy legs, and they call him the mechanic because of how he works, and kind of a dirty work guy. But losing Nick Scorton on the edge on defense is going to hurt. Man. The Big Ten's top pass rusher as far as sacks transfers to Texas A&M, but they also have potentially the next great Big Ten safety, who's a true freshman this year, free safety. That guy can run, man. He can run. He'll hit you. I think he had 5 or 6 picks. And I cannot wait to see the next 2 or 3 years for him in that defense.
You got to build your defense around him. As long as we're talking about this, before we move on to the next team, there has been an exodus, a mass exodus in the transfer portal from Purdue after year one. I still got some eligibility left. I could play wide receiver, right? Because they have zero wide receivers left in there. What a Deion Burks went to Oklahoma, and all of these guys are gone. What was kind of your impression over these last few weeks when you saw, and you mentioned Nick Scorton on the defensive side of the ball? It's both offense and defense. What was kind of your impression when you saw guy after guy after guy from this Purdue team enter the transfer portal?
Yeah. I think I'll have a better answer for you, as we all will, after the late signing period in February. And, spring is interesting now, too, because guys are going to transfer at the summer semester. Mm-hmm. I thought the guy that we might be talking about this time of year is maybe not a surprising pickup, because a lot of people are talking about him, but Penn State got Dante Cephas mid-summer last year, and I thought he was going to turn into, maybe a surprising breakout guy in the Big Ten. But I'm kind of on wide receiver watch in that way for Purdue because of what you mentioned, how that room is just kind of cleared out. But no matter who they have personnel-wise, I feel like they will find a way with a good quarterback to scheme it up, even if they don't have a Deion Burks type pass catcher. But I would guess that they will find those guys, whether it's an immediate impact guy in their early class that they signed in December out of high school, or somebody in the February signing period, or in the transfer portal that like, okay, that's a good pickup, and he ends up being a guy that we're not even thinking of right now.
Yeah, and then tight end Garrett Miller, I think, went to Texas A&M. I believe Max Clare comes back, a young kid at tight end. So yeah, if I'm Purdue, I think you're selling the opportunity to these kids in maybe the spring transfer portal, if they can still get kids now and everything, and say, hey, we got a quarterback that's been proven, veteran quarterback in Hudson Card. We've got Devin Mockobee, I should say. I was mixing him up with Dylan Downing. But Devin Mockobee kind of back there as well. I think there's an opportunity for kids to kind of come in as well. Let's head over to Lincoln, Nebraska. Boy, did they make some news a few weeks ago, right, with the Dylan Raiola signing. But before that, it was turnovers, one more time. Turnovers for the Nebraska Cornhuskers. I've got so many different thoughts on this team as we look back in 2023. The offense, right? It was very clear from the outset. It was Jeff Sims was not going to be the answer. This was not going to be the deal. So then you got to go to a guy like a Heinrich Harburg, and you got to call up Tom Osborne and say, how do we run this option out of the I formation, right? And all of these kind of ripple effects. And don't forget about the injuries, right, at the skill positions. Gabe Ervin Jr. Goes down. Ramir Johnson goes down. Marcus Washington goes down. They had injuries on the offensive line, yet they still found a way to be, 5-3 towards the end of the season as they were entering November throughout all of this thing. What was kind of your overall thoughts on this Nebraska team that also had maybe the surprise of the season, just how good that Tony White defense was? Yeah,
and I think that was maybe the most interesting defensive question in the Big Ten going into the year, is how is the 3-3-5 going to play in this league? And it turns out pretty well. The thing that I look at just with Matt Rule, year one at Baylor, he was 1-11. Next year they got it rolling. I think they won 7 games. Then they won 11 games and played in the Sugar Bowl by his 3rd year. So from an optimistic viewpoint, if you're a Nebraska fan, you're 4 wins ahead of schedule on where Matt Rule was building Baylor in his first year. And by the way, you just signed Dylan Raiola, a 5-star quarterback who could come in and start right away. You mentioned the turnover issues at quarterback. It ended up being, I think, 10 passing touchdowns and 16 picks this year. So a lot of that was on the shoulders of the 3 quarterbacks that Nebraska played. I was actually at the game that Dylan Raiola played down in Buford, Georgia, where he had his one turnover this year. And this needs to be part of the conversation with that one turnover. It was a wet, rainy, nasty night. So you take that out of it, and he was flawless his senior year of high school down in Georgia protecting the ball. So I think that's number one with what you're getting in Dylan Raiola. And then two, just talking to people that evaluate and are on the recruiting scene 365, like he doesn't really have a weakness. Like there were some other quarterbacks in this class that maybe had bigger arms, maybe are more physically gifted than he is as far as being able to run and that sort of thing. Like DJ Lagway is somebody that comes to mind that signed with Florida, Julian Sayin, who signed with Alabama. But as far as a complete prospect, Dylan Raiola is as complete, maybe as college ready as any of those guys that were toward the top of that quarterback class. And Nebraska just signed him. So not that Nebraska fans need any more reason to be excited about that, but seeing him up close in person was really, really impressive. And it's going to be cool to follow him and cover him in the Big Ten now too.
So when Dylan Raiola is in that first game against UTEP at Memorial Stadium, and Connor's calling it on Big Ten Network, and he turns it over, okay, let's not automatically put it on Connor right away. That's all we're saying.
Raining, right?
Yeah, it might be raining that early or in late August, early in the football season as well. Rutgers found an identity. I want to go to the Scarlet Knights because, man, do you know that's about college football. Right now. You got to know who you are, and you got to sell it. Rutgers knows who they are. Greg Schiano, man, there is nobody else that should lead that Rutgers football program. Toughness, good defense, physicality, and attitude. Kyle Monangai was so fun to watch run the football here this season at Rutgers. Because you called at very least one of those games, I'm pretty sure, with the Scarlet Knights this season. What was kind of your takeaway on Rutgers finding their identity, getting to a bowl game, and then winning a bowl game in their backyard?
Yeah. Greg Schiano, his first time there, he had Ray Rice, of course, at running back. And then early in his second stint now at Rutgers, he had Isaiah Pacheco, who's good NFL running back now. And every time we talked to him, he brought up those two guys as kind of the blend of who Kyle Monangai has become. This violent runner, and how that fits their identity. He may have used the word chop a few times, which is their thing. Minnesota rows the boat, Rutgers chops. But the other thing is special teams. The comeback that Rutgers had in the Michigan State game, they were down. I forget how many points it was in the fourth quarter. They were
a good amount.
Down,
yeah, I forgot too.
Maybe 15 to 18 points in the fourth quarter. They turned it on special teams. They blocked a punt, and then some of the subtleties that maybe a common football fan wouldn't pick up on tape. That's the first place that opposing coaches would go to when we cover Rutgers. We'd ask what stands out about Rutgers, and they would always say they're going to come out and do 6 different things that we're not expecting on punt block and in punt coverage. And that showed up again when they beat Indiana, which was the win that got them to bowl eligibility. Got them their 6th win is they blocked a punt early in that game, and then Indiana really never had a chance to come back because kind of sucked the life out of that stadium. So the run game, that blue-collar identity, and special teams, plus their defense, it was kind of Greg Schiano to a T with what they put on the field this year. And now the question is, can they take it to the next level at quarterback? Gavin Wimsatt had some moments and some throws. Like I'm talking far hash to the other side of the field on the sideline throws where you're just like, whoa, like that was an NFL throw. And then there were some moments where he was off target on a 5-yard pitch. So he's going to have some competition. Ethan Kaliak-Manis, who was starting at Minnesota, goes in there, and interested to see those two fight it out for who starts.
Well, that's funny that you kind of say that about Gavin Wimsatt, because they're bringing in a guy in Ethan Kaliakmanis that I believe has kind of similar traits where, okay, he had flashes of brilliance, but then again, he throws it behind a wide receiver on a simple throw and you scratch your head. I know there's some connections, obviously, between Kirk Shiraka and Ethan, right? Their year together, of course. PJ Fleck and that staff kind of brought him in to Minnesota, so maybe that's the connection that they're looking for. But I think you've got very similar type of quarterbacks with what you've kind of just mentioned. This screams to me that maybe Ethan comes in, gives competition, and they brought him in for a reason. And we could see maybe Gavin possibly depart maybe in the spring transfer portal period as well for Rutgers. But I just love good special teams. Like, that's the thing. We talked about beautiful and ugly here before. I love seeing sound special teams. Like, I think there's some teams out there that just won a national championship where maybe special teams wasn't the best the last 2 games of the year. Obviously, they figured it out. Obviously, they got good talent and other units across that team. But, man, it's so great to see a block punt and just teams win in different ways. We talked about Iowa with that before, and obviously Rutgers kind of fits into that as well. We got 3 more teams left: Michigan State, Indiana, and Maryland. For the Spartans, I think it started in the spring, right, when Peyton Thorne and Keon Coleman, right, entered the portal. They kind of had to scramble to put this thing together, right? That kind of got you in a quarterback battle with Noah Kim and Caton Hauser as well. Sam Levitt saw some time, and now all 3 of those quarterbacks are headed the other way as well. So let's kind of talk about this. Of course, it's the midseason turmoil, right, that kind of maybe led to the season that they had at Michigan State. What's kind of your outlook for the Spartans? Because a lot like Nebraska, it's about the turnovers.
Yeah, it was about the turnovers, and I think it was a lot about schedule too. They were, that's life in the Big Ten East. Is you knew who they were going to have to play in the division, but scheduling Washington definitely didn't help them. Michigan State had a top 10 strength of schedule in the country.
Oh yeah,
and they lost their coach week 2, and they had to play Washington right away, and then they got blown out by Michigan, and then Ohio State and Penn State later in the year. So, I thought that this was a year where they were going to get back to bowl eligibility after the disappointment of the year before.
Mm-hmm.
Did I think they were going to go on a surprise run like they did a couple years ago when they won 11 games? No. Maybe they built it up with Mel Tucker going into this year, and then this was the launching point into another one of those seasons. But this was, in my eyes, this was always going to be, a 6, 7, 8 win type year where you don't beat Michigan, Ohio State, or Penn State.
That's Kevin's point. When you play Michigan, Ohio State, Washington, and Penn State, especially after all the losing probably your best player in the spring in Keon Coleman, and saw what he did at Florida State. That's tough. But I tell you what, future's bright. I love what Michigan State has done. Okay, there's a lot of teams. Yeah, sure, Oregon, you go out and get Dylan Gabriel and all these transfer core, Will Rogers at Washington. Those are great, but Jonathan Smith is a program builder coming in from Oregon State. Aiden Childs, I'm excited about him. Maybe Big Ten fans that aren't aware of the name Aiden Childs, watch his film. And I know this is going to be a lofty comparison. I see Lamar Jackson. I see the long, lanky running ability. I just see a lot of that, right? Of course, he's got a ways to go to officially get to that level and where Lamar was at Louisville. But Michigan State has done some really good things. Where do you see the future of this program? Because I don't know if it's going to happen year one, but this is a Sparty team that could really add some depth to the Big Ten if they continue to improve at the rate that they are since Jonathan Smith has taken over.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of the Lamar comparison with Childs. That's an interesting one. The connection there obviously makes sense, him coming with Jonathan Smith from Oregon State. Yeah. I did think just for a moment when Dante Moore, a former 5-star quarterback, on the transfer portal, he's a Michigan guy. Yep. Maybe he goes to Michigan because J.J. McCarthy goes to the NFL, but I thought Michigan State made a lot of sense. He's from Detroit, mobile guy, kind of like Childs is, but Childs is a really, really good get.
Yes.
Excited to see if he ends up influencing how they build. Obviously, he will influence how they build the rest of that quarterback room. But having a young quarterback that is almost a lock to start, who else do they get? Do they get an older quarterback that's content being a backup? Do they get an older quarterback that's going to come in and compete with him right away and maybe be a one-year fill? I don't know. It's kind of an interesting thing after all those guys in that quarterback room left after last year. So there's not an obvious backup at this point.
And I think they got a transfer from North Dakota, maybe to be their backup as well. But you kind of touched on it and why I love this Aiden Childs pickup specifically. He's right. They're bringing their offensive coordinator, Brian Lindgren, over from Oregon State. There's no learning the playbook. He's been in this system for a year. A lot of times when you're a transfer quarterback, you're going to a new spot. Sometimes you have a new coordinator, and there's some stuff to learn in a short period of time. I think Aiden Childs can kind of hit the ground running. He's a young quarterback. You see a lot of these. Will Rogers will be one and done. Will Howard will be one and done. Gillen Gabriel will be one and done. Excuse me. But man, I think maybe not this year, but next year. Maybe Michigan State and Aiden Childs could maybe make some noise. Let's head over to Bloomington, Indiana. Boy, it was a tough year for the Hoosiers. They brought in a lot of transfers. You were on the Indiana beat there for for your first couple of games of the season. They did not quit under Tom Allen. There was a point during this season where you could have maybe seen some of that and factor with maybe some other teams, but they kept on fighting and fighting and fighting. After that Rutgers loss, they were competitive against Penn State, one-score games the rest of the way, beat Wisconsin, Illinois, Michigan State, Purdue. You flip two of those, and Tom Allen might still be the head coach in Bloomington, Indiana.
They were a 4th and goal from the 1 away from overtime against Louisville at Lucas Oil Stadium, and Louisville went on to play for the ACC championship. So that was an early season inflection point. I know the fan base was really alarmed when they went to 4 overtimes against Akron, and that's understandable. That was probably the worst game they played all year, and I thought maybe that would be a point where they lay down, and after they lost to Rutgers, maybe this is just the end of it, and they're non-competitive the rest of the way. But I remember asking Tom Allen, like, how do you stay optimistic through this? And he just answered point blank, "It's not hard. It's just who I am." Like that was like the perfect Tom Allen answer to me. And I think their quarterback situation is interesting. Taven Jackson was named the guy, and then it was a competition again. Brendan Sorsby was the guy late in the year. Now he transfers to Cincinnati. Curtis Rourke is coming in from Ohio at quarterback. So that's something interesting to watch. This kind of early outlook for the Hoosiers, and then you got Kurt Cignetti talking a big game. I mean, he's on set with the people at our network on the studio show, talking about how he figures he better make this trip to Indianapolis now because the Hoosiers are going to be there next year. So, and then what? 2 days later, he's at the basketball game and he's saying we're going to beat Ohio State, we're going to beat Michigan, we're going to beat Purdue. So I can't think of the last time that we've had that type of boldness publicly as far as the rhetoric coming out of Indiana football. So whether that succeeds or whether that becomes bulletin board stuff that gets played back on social media after, it's going to be entertaining.
So here's what I'll say. Some people have said, what is Kurt Cignetti talking about? Indiana coming out here and saying this and name dropping Michigan and Ohio State. And obviously what you mentioned on the Big Ten Network set before the Michigan-Iowa Big Ten Championship. I actually love what Kurt Cignetti is doing right now. In today's day and age, you need to stand out. Right? You need to create buzz. You need to do that. And, man, he has got some moxie. For Indiana to go from Tom Allen to Kurt Cignetti, it's the same, but it's different, right? You see that energy. I think you see you see that confidence really come out in Curt Cignetti. And at a program like Indiana, where you maybe want to stand out as it pertains to transfers, to recruits, this is maybe a way to do that to help yourself stand out. PJ Fleck has done it with the row the boat mantra at Minnesota. When you get to some of these programs like that, that's kind of what you need to do. Let's finish this thing up with Maryland, and then we'll talk about the future. I got inconsistency here written on my notes. I see the Northwestern game. Okay, but Northwestern ended up being a good team, a solid 7-5, won the bowl game to go to 8-5, and then they let it all out on the line against Michigan, right? I think you saw some inconsistencies throughout all of the season. The offensive line, I don't think, did themselves any favor with Talia Tungavailoa, of course, back there. What's kind of your thoughts on Maryland football? I know you've covered them this year.
Yeah, and they've been right there every year from Talia's time being the quarterback of a breakthrough win, or maybe they play with Michigan the whole game like they did this year, or they hang with Ohio State for a while like they did in the game this year. And I don't think it's fair that a lot of that has come back on Talia. The questions that Mike Locksley got before his final game were a lot in the vein of he's got all these yards, he set all these records, but I think the impact that he's going to have there long term is you've got a good high school quarterback that can come to Maryland and succeed at quarterback. It had been a while since they had a guy like that. So maybe he wasn't the guy to get that signature win, but I think he set them up, whether it's this year with MJ Morris coming in from NC State, or it's a high school recruit that they bring in and develop. We're going to look back and say that was the start of it with Talia Tungavailoa, and he helped set Maryland on the path that they're on.
We've talked about both of these East Coast programs, and there was a point where people were saying about Maryland and Rutgers and them belonging or not within this conference. You look at what Maryland has done the last handful of seasons, right? Consecutive bowl bids, 7 wins, 8 wins. You see what Rutgers is doing now. They are consistent teams right now. Rutgers is building up to that, and what Maryland has been able to do under Mike Locksley has been awfully impressive. So that's the year in review, and what a year it was here within this conference. But Connor, let's talk about the future. Everybody wants to know about the future. The national championship game was maybe a glimpse into that future. You've got high-flying offense out west, the number one offense in the country in Washington, and you've got that traditional old-school Big Ten mantra over on the other side for the University of Michigan. Everybody wants to know, in this contrast of styles, which style's going to win out? National championship, it was Michigan. It was the traditional Big Ten style defense and all that winning out. But just because that happened doesn't mean Iowa's going to beat Oregon or Nebraska's going to beat USC, right, all of these times. How do you view the contrast of styles going forward between these West Coast programs and the teams in the traditional Big Ten footprint?
Yeah, I think Michigan showed that you can win a national championship in a little bit of a different way. With how they play offensively and building it around their front seven and really their entire defense. But Manny Diaz, who was the defensive coordinator at Penn State this year and is now the Duke head coach, he said something interesting to me in the spring, just about doing some of their self scout at Penn State and also scouting really the entire schedule that they're about to play, because he's been in the ACC. He's basically seen it all at the Power 5 level. He's been around just about every league. And I asked him, what do people get wrong about the Big Ten when you talk about the offenses in the Big Ten? And he said, people say 3 yards in a cloud of dust, but I think that's a mischaracterization. Like it's more complex than that, and we're seeing more things that are modern than the Big Ten gets credit for. So was there some ugliness or some beauty in the eye of the beholder with some of the Big Ten West teams this year and in several years past? Yes. But you see it in the NFL, and that's what everybody says we're coming to, right? Is we're coming to an AFC and an NFC with the Big Ten and the SEC. Like there's going to be copycat stuff. And I really think that the copycat influence is going to have those 4 West Coast teams all over it, which means we're going to kind of push more toward that style with the new Big Ten rather than some of the beauty that we were talking about before.
So I've always said this when comparing the West Coast teams versus the traditional teams in the footprint, especially teams like in Iowa, Nebraska, historically Wisconsin, even though they're kind of changing over to a newer style of things. I always thought they needed to meet in the middle, right? I always thought West Coast teams maybe needed to beef up a little bit better on defense, and some of the teams like the Iowa, they're going to need to get more dynamic on the offensive side of the football. And this is when I talk about being excited for 2024, this is why I'm so excited, is because of these contrast in styles. Like, I wanted to see USC play Iowa this year in a bowl game, right? Where you take a team with a great defense and a bad offense, and then it's almost the exact opposite on the other side. I think that's what makes this so intriguing and some of these matchups so fun to watch going forward. I got to ask you this question, okay? Big Ten Network, they're going to be headed out to the West Coast. Okay, yeah. You might be getting your tan on, hitting the beach in Southern California, getting some coffee up there in the shadow of the Space Needle up in Seattle, and of course Autzen is a great atmosphere. Where are you looking to possibly call a Big Ten Network game out on the West Coast? Which venue stands out, because those are 4 of the best?
Yeah, I don't tan, Ted. I blister. That's for sure. I don't really know if I can pick one. I've never been to any of the new 4 as a fan. Coincidentally enough, a week before the announcement of the expansion with Oregon and Washington this summer, I think I told you the story when I was on in the fall, actually. I happened to be driving down the coast just for vacation and actually saw all 4 spots. So I've been all 4 places. Autzen Stadium, it never rains. I'm really excited to potentially get a chance to go there and check that out. I would love to sailgate before a game at Husky Stadium, and then they're USC and UCLA, obviously cathedrals in college football too. But even some of the current members in the schools where I haven't had a chance to call one of their games on site yet, Memorial Stadium at Nebraska. I've called volleyball there. I called the women's volleyball match outside. Right, yeah. That had me itching a little bit to do a football game there. I called the spring game at Beaver Stadium last year for Penn State, or this past spring, and then haven't called a game at the Big House yet. So the 4 new ones are exciting, but I'd love to check off some of the ones in the current iteration of the Big Ten too. So wherever they send me, I'm happy to be talking ball. But there is a lot to be excited about with the expansion of the Big Ten and seeing some new places.
Yeah, and it's going to be interesting because 2024 is really, out of all the changes, this is the first, right? You're on the TV side of things, as I'm occasionally on the TV side of things. You're going to get, now you're in the first full year of this deal. Of course, CBS was overlapping this year. So we might be seeing more of Connor with all these games, right? With more, you got to think there's going to be more games per week possibly on the Big Ten Network as well. So that's going to be fun. I can't let you go without asking you this. What's it like to work with Bill Raftery?
It was first of all, I'm now able to check off that question that I get anytime somebody asks me. It's real, because everybody's like, "Have you ever done a game with Bill Raftery?" Like, that's too perfect. So I give my bosses at Big Ten Network all the credit in the world for leaning into that and going along with that bit. But the morning of shoot-arounds, I hadn't really, or the morning of the game, we go to shoot-around, which is the 3-game practice kind of walkthrough that the teams have. I thought, I got to do something. I got to lean into this a little bit when we're on camera today, since his catchphrase is onions and my last name is Onion. So I just walked into a grocery store in East Lansing, bought nothing other than 2 onions, and I walked around that entire day with Bill Raftery with just a bag of onions. And
Oh,
He,
that's great.
we're talking to Tom Izzo, the Michigan State head coach. We're talking to Rick Barnes, the Tennessee head coach. I've got this bag on my hip. They'll never ask me what was in the bag. So either he knew and didn't want to ruin my surprise,
Yeah.
which is very cool of him, or somehow I pulled a fast one on him and I actually surprised him with a couple of onions on it. So, but he was so gracious, and got to spend 2 or 3 hours with him the night before the game having dinner. And as you can imagine, maybe we can do a different episode sometime, and I can tell you some of the stories that came out of that meal. But he had amazing Big Ten and Big East stories for me.
That's great. Yeah, I sent that screenshot of you guys on your on camera open, holding the onions to a few people. I thought it was awesome. I told my mom and dad are avid basketball viewers. I'm like, did you check this out? You got to check this out. So that was great to allow to play into it a little bit, to have a little bit of fun. One more last thing before we let you go. The Big Ten men's and women's basketball tournaments are going to be in Minneapolis. Of course, Purdue on the men's side of things. Iowa on the women's side of things appear to be capturing all of the headlines. Give us some maybe headlines, some things to watch for, right? This is normally a football space, but on the basketball space, now that football is done, maybe more people are going to be shifting over to the basketball, saying what is kind of some things to keep an eye out for, some maybe teams, players, etc. on the men's side and the women's side.
Yeah, I'll start on the men's side. Your Badgers are not the Badgers of your youth, Ted. I mean, they can score the ball a little bit. They can hit you for 80, 85 points. So they're a team that I think will maybe surprise some people compared to preseason expectations. Illinois has a really, really good team in men's basketball, and I'm sure people have at least been somewhat aware of what's happened with one of their guards, Terrence Shannon, who's indefinitely suspended. But even without him, they looked really good in the 3 games they've played since then. They're a top 10 team in the country, and are more than just one player. And that's, I think, an evolving story throughout the year. Can they get him back? What will the legal ramifications be of the charges against him? There's a hearing on Friday, so we might get some more information here this week. But those are a couple of teams right up at the top. Northwestern just beat Michigan State. They beat Purdue. They got blown out by Illinois. How good are they going to be? I think that's a big question on the men's side. They've got one of the most exciting guards in the Big Ten, Boo Buie. And then on the women's side, I've had a chance to cover Iowa and Ohio State so far. So those are the 2 teams I'm most familiar with. I've got Illinois coming up in an FS1 game here shortly, but those are 2 of the best teams in the country. I think Caitlin Clark needs no introduction. He had the logo step back 3 to beat Michigan State last Tuesday night. So Indiana, they're a contender too. They've got one of my favorite players in college basketball in the post, Mackenzie Holmes. Love watching her play. So those are the 3 at the top of my mind right now on the women's side.
You can catch Connor Onion calling Big Ten basketball, Big Ten football, Big East, right, has been thrown in there as well with some of those programs out there. Connor, thanks for joining me this evening, and I'm sure we'll hook up again soon. The men's and women's basketball tournaments in Minneapolis. I was there for the women's last year, so we might see you around there. So until next time, have a good one.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me, Ted. Happy to do it anytime.
All right, that is Connor Onion from the Big Ten Network here, ladies and gentlemen. And that will complete our year in review episode here tonight, as 2023 is officially in the books. And now on this channel, we are looking forward to 2024. So until next time, I'm Big Ten Ted. We'll see you in the next one.